Hi, hello everybody. It's quite rare for me to come to Europe, and I thought I was being very smart coming in June, but it makes no difference. It makes no difference. So my name is Jepchumba, and I'm from Kenya, and I have a secret love affair, and I'm going to share with you guys. It's quite torrid and passionate and very, very secret. But before that, I thought you'd want to get to know a little bit more about me before you judge me harshly. So, I'm Jepchumba. I'm a digital artist, and from a very young age, I found that I was a digital girl living in a very particular time, and I felt very lucky for it because I imagined, what would I be doing in 1986? Probably be underneath some lab again, I don't know. But anyway, digital art provided this way for me to imagine myself in really crazy, fantastical places and then create like visually like compelling work to actually put myself there. So you can say I have delusions of grandeur. This is something that I made, and I'm going to go very fast over the things that I make because it makes me still nervous. What is that? So this is some more artwork that I made. So when I began my journey as a digital artist, one of the things that I did was, it was very difficult for me to find a place to study because I found myself in between this world of technology, but then also this art side and creative side, and then also this other side, which is like I actually want to be a philosopher, but you can't really be like an 18-year-old philosopher. Nobody takes you seriously. So I was trying to find this space for myself, and the internet was this new sort of invention that called for weirdness. And I was like, this is perfect. So I found myself in AOL chat rooms, like causing havoc on people's lives and then watching it. Like AOL chat rooms, I don't know if you guys remember those. Wow, there's so many younger people than I expected. But it was this really weird space in the internet. And the internet wasn't really necessarily as defined as we thought. There were all these like random rooms that you could get yourself into. And I found at this time that I still wasn't there wasn't really a space for me that was developed because I was a person who was interested in technology and creativity as well. So at that time, I did a Google search on Africa. This was not that long ago, guys. It was like 2000. It was in the 2000s. And every search that came up in Google, especially like on African creativity or African art, was usually The Lion King. So thanks. And then usually like a sunset, a picture orange. You see this. You can see it in your mind, like a giraffe, right? Yeah? And like off in the distance there's somebody like by a fire sipping tea and thinking, wow, Africa, you know? So I made it my mission to change Google searches. So I developed this thing called African Digital Art. And African Digital Art is an online space that now has like over 2,000 projects from around the world. I featured animators, filmmakers, musicians, people who are doing VR, people who are doing crazy things like architecture things, like creative people like myself who are really living at the same time as everybody else is, trying to figure out exactly what we're doing here, and what opportunities are we facing with all of this new technology. And I was very surprised when I made African Digital Art that the feedback that I would get was like, are you sure this is African? And I'm like, well, the artist is from Cameroon and he lives there. I don't know. This is what he's into. He's a punk rock graffiti artist that's into heavy metal. I don't know what to tell you. That is African. But there was this disbelief that Africa was actually living in the same space and time as the rest of the world. That somehow Africa was in this like long lost place, that we had to bring it into modernity by introducing things like the World Wide Web and internet. Ooh. And like that somehow a mobile phone will change the history and revolution of Africa, which was quite strange for me coming from Kenya, where I felt like I was in the future compared to the rest of the world, because I had something like mobile banking. So for example, when I would go to the States, I'd have to like use a credit card, this plastic thing with numbers on it, and put it in some machine and money would come out. But I was living in a country where I literally, from my phone, I could do business transactions while I was, you'd think I was texting, but I was just moving money around, you know? So I was like I was very disheartened by this long legacy or image that we have of what exactly Africa is. And so I soon realized that we sort of have this understanding of Africa. Even Africans ourselves, actually, we were probably, you know. And this kind of does a lot to you, especially you here, because you're part of this history, and this is part of who you are. So I decided to make my mission to push digital boundaries by showing people that there are stories, especially within Africa. I didn't really care about the rest of the world at this time, but I really wanted to show people from Africa that there were other artists and creatives who were making things that reflected more of who they were. And it was something simple as like showing character designs for other artists. They were like, wow, never even considered it. Usually when I have to make something, I have to start from like a European sort of perspective, like a Russian tutorial person from YouTube. I don't know if you guys have gone on the tutorial lives. There's not many nerds in here. This is surprising. Okay, so for me, like I really decided, rather than becoming a person who's just trying to shout over and over and over that, you know, guys, like Africa is not a country, it's a continent that lives in 2019 with the rest of us and has people who have feelings and wishes and dreams and hopes just like you. I decided, like, let me ignore that and just focus on the artists and like try to understand what they were doing. But every time I try to do something, I get pulled in another direction. That's why I'm actually currently farming, but I'm here in Sheffield, you see. So what I ended up finding out was, because I was on the internet, because I was using technology, I became labeled an Afrofuturist. So according to me, Afrofuturist has a much better fashion design sense than I do. They like wear a lot of jewelry. Like I thought of Afrofuturism and like a space helmet and a spacesuit, but with Afro kind of things. And I thought of Sun Ra. So I was quite confused as to why I was being labeled an Afrofuturist. So I thought maybe it's because of the projects that I showcased, that I'm showing things to people that are so out of their understanding that they have to designate it somehow in the future because it's prescribed to Africa. I don't know. Anyway, so I couldn't really understand what it was, so I decided the best way that I can understand what Afrofuturism is to make a time machine. So I made a time machine. There's no clapping? Oh my gosh. Oh yeah, I thought that would get more than that. So I made a time machine, and it's quite hard to make a time machine. There's a lot of thinking. You think science. But I realized, like, in this process of making a time machine, I ended up let me describe my time machine. So my time machine was sort of like a booth that you would walk into, and you would choose how far you would go into the future, right? So you'd say, like, oh, I want to go 100 years to the future. But if you went into the future in 100 years, it was very limited. You couldn't go to, like, New York City 100 years from now. You were still in that booth. I told you, time travel is very complicated. And there you were supposed to record a message to yourself in the present. So you would go into the booth and you're 100 years in the future, and then you're now talking to yourself saying, hey, Jepchumba, pay attention, that guy is not worth it. Like things like that, you know, like messages from yourself from the future. And this whole entire idea, I called it the future selfie boothy, like a future selfie booth. I wanted to create like a booth where people would take selfies but record messages from themselves from the future. But this was all an exercise into something that many people have not been doing, which is speculative thinking. Like, it was actually quite an emotional thing when people would go into this booth and start trying to think of what would they tell themselves. Like, if I was like 100 years from now? What was the thing that I would say to myself? And a lot of these messages were quite personal and very sweet and very interesting and crazy. And how I ended up rigging the whole system was that that message that you recorded in the booth would be automatically sent to you at a period that you didn't know. So like one day, you're checking your email, and I triggered it to last like a few months later. You get an email saying, "Hey, Julia, you got a message from yourself from the future." And there's this weird video of you standing in this weird booth saying, "Hi, this is from the future, Julia." So it was just like a really interesting game about future thinking and speculative thinking, because even our ideas of what the future is are so controlled by the media and the films that we watch and the science fiction movies that we watch, right? So after this experimentation, I thought about I came back to the present and I thought, what exactly is wrong with the technology that we have? What's wrong with the devices and the platforms that we're making today? And I realized one of the things that we're missing is that we've never really gave much thought of making a computer that reflects the African mind. First of all, we don't even know what the African mind is. Even this sentence is quite interesting, right? Because there's now this assumption that technology is supposed to be neutral, that it's supposed to be a universal representation of what we are. We think when we type on the QWERTY keyboard, that somehow, of course, this is a genius idea that some scientist has come from that has mapped out human fingerprints and decided these letters make sense together, but it's not like that. It's just something that we've taken for granted. So I thought, what would a computer be if it came from a completely different place, from Chad, for example? What kind of operating system would that look like? What are the things that would lead us? What kind of inventions or what kind of conversations that would we have? This also led me to discover that the internet, for some reason, even though we call it the World Wide Web, it's not really worldwide. Most of it is in English. And there was this hope in the beginning that the internet was going to be this place where all of these crazy languages would be preserved, and people could even be more weird and more strange and create more things. But we've kind of become more and more homogenized in a way, to the point where even celebrities are dying that I didn't know, but I'm crying. I'm I don't even know this guy, but everybody on Instagram is telling me it's sad, you know? And so I started thinking of what other things are missing from this new technology, the space. And I realized that the centers for myth making or storytelling were very small and specific. That even as storytellers and artists and creatives, we weren't really pushing the boundaries of what we could do in terms of how we could change perspectives and alternative realities. But great thing that we're in an alternative reality conference, because you guys will have great ideas about messing with the world secretly, because I secretly want to be a Bond villain, guys. I'm looking for a volcano island, if anyone has one. And then I also thought, perhaps, maybe what if we created this new technology that also provided a space in the future for giving people tools for healing each other, rather than even just calling out what the problems were. Unfortunately, fortunately and unfortunately, it's a double-edged sword. This connectivity that we've had together has connected us to each other, and it has brought so many people calling out things that we weren't even aware of were problems, you know? And now we just are reeling in all of this hurt and damage and all of these things that we have to wade through, but we are not equipped, or we don't know exactly how to do it. So a lot of it is figuring around, and a lot of it is leading us to feel completely isolated from each other. Somehow our natural instinct of confusion, of not understanding what's happening, of feeling all of these symptoms like anxiety, depression, all of these things are something that we should be ashamed of, because we haven't really created as many tools for collaborative healing, of engaging each other, rubbing up against each. Remember, we used to be into disco and dancing, and we'd smell people. People were much more stinkier. You know, people now are like very reserved and everybody's in headphones and like we live in these really nicely perfumed bubbles, you know. I'm not complaining. You all smell delicious. Yeah. So I also thought like what else these new possibilities of the technology that we currently have could we have? And I was like, what if we started making these really cool imagination and reality generators where we'd invite people to just like play and like, have at it. Just create a new pattern of living, completely original. And I'm actually quite encouraged to see that happening more and more. Like where you're having people who are like, yo, I am living as the color purple today. Because I feel like it. And then everybody around them are pretty much like, okay, that makes sense to me. You know, in 2019, okay, you can express yourself as much as you want to and feel like you can because there are all of these other people who are doing the same thing, you know? So like I also want, I guess I continue to imagine like this internet or this technology that we're experiencing as a place for more and more of these imagination and reality generator. And then I realized that eventually, if I wanted to make any sort of impact on the future, if I wanted to do anything that was worth of sort of preserving who I was and my legacy and my purpose of being here, is that I had to create an archival army. So I come from a place where within 70-year period, my like hundreds and thousands of years of history were completely destroyed. That we had to start learning history, like as if the world came into being when the Portuguese ships arrived in the east coast of Kenya. And from then on, like we had to think and imagine. It felt like for so long, even my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, that we were suffering from some sort of amnesia, you know? And there was like this deep desire to connect to a past that was like almost impossible to recreate or understand. So I decided like I need to be part of, in this generation, part of an army of people who are archiving ways of being currently. So that next, in 100 years, people wouldn't be as confused as I was, starting from scratch. So I realized also that I had been doing this the whole way, which is doing African digital art, like having that as like a living testament of like all of creativity as much as I could possibly do. So all of these things, by the way, I hope that you guys can sort of make as well. I want to invite you to make like a computer from different types of minds, especially an African mind. I'm slightly on this zone. Create technologies that or experiences that encourage other languages other than English. Have more centers of myth making, you know? There are really great names that you can come up with. You know, I'm not going to tell you all of them because of my Bond villain aspirations, but having more centers where we encourage other people to be in the habit of creating alternative possibilities and realities. Create tools for collaborative healing, create generators of reality, and then also being always in the process as you're making work that you're archiving and documenting this process as well, because process is such an important part of who we are. And unfortunately, like, you know, I get so jealous when I come to Europe that I can go to a gallery and I want to see like an Italian designer from 1956 and see like, oh, what were the typefaces that were they into? And it doesn't take me that long to go find like, oh, Italian typeface from this village. I can see it all there, and I'm like, okay, I like this. I'll choose that. But in many, many spaces in Africa, we don't have that at all. Like, there's nothing to start from. So after all of this work of the internet and thinking of the future and African digital art, I got tired. And I also got tired of the internet, and I also got tired of computers and machines, and I felt as though I wasn't really necessarily experiencing reality. I felt very comfortable in rooms where you can meet other people who are like, wow, I agree. And I found that when I found myself in a room with somebody who was like, ugh, I disagree, I was like, oh, I can't, I don't know what has happened to me. And I think it's a symptom of the world that we're living in, where we are so particular about our interactions. Like if somebody is talking to you that you don't like, blue check marks. Only I'm not gonna answer. Do you guys know about blue check marks? Nobody on WhatsApp, when somebody texts you and you ask them something important and they just leave you with the blue check marks forever. Okay, clearly this is my problem. So anyway, this is just to say that there's all of these different ways also of isolation that this technology has provided. So my mom actually called me on this really great mission, which was to build a school for girls in the middle of nowhere. So I wanted to share a little bit about Concord Girls. And Concord Girls is a school, it's a high school, with 125 young women from the village that I came from. And it's something that my mom and I built from brick up, from downloading ideas from the internet, trying to coerce people from around our community to build this center for learning that would also leave a legacy, that would leave a great legacy. So we want Concord Girls actually to be the center where we have a group of women who will be will be as powerful and as involved in the conversation about how we design the future as much as other people from other parts of the world. So that's the whole idea, of future thinking. So that's a little bit about Concord Girls. But the reason why I'm actually here is to talk to you about my torrid love affair, remember? You guys want to know about that? Okay. So I've been working on African digital art for the longest time, of providing all of these visual, I've been in visual culture and trying to really change the way we actually see and perceive Africa for the past 10, 11 years. But I always had this secret inclination that audio was really the best place to be. So I created this podcast called Future Lab Africa. And what I realized is that Africa has this long history with radio. In many, many places, if you go in most random places, there might not be anything around you for miles, but there will be a radio station, a local radio star, who's trying to be like, hey, I'm the man. We have this long, complex, interesting relationship with radio that has still not died. And I started listening to all these different radio stations wherever I would go, and I realized that audio is the best time-traveling device ever created. And I realized that we all participate in time travel all the time. And we've been doing it for centuries, and we've been doing it through music. Anyone ever listen to a song and it takes you right back to that day you broke up with that guy who didn't deserve you? No, right? That's a joke. Or anybody listen to a sound and you have that immediate taking you into a place or a space that you've never been before, and somehow years later you have a sense of déjà vu that comes from that song? Nobody? So yes, okay, thank you. Participatory, engagement, interaction. So music and sound has this time travel quality that we as visual people have completely ignored because screens are dazzling, So I decided to take on another future project. And this one would celebrate Africa's legacy of technology by interviewing. It started out as me interviewing exceptional people who have created incredible technologies that we're using every day, but are seldom given credit for it because of where they are, what part of the world that they're from. So I wanted to interview philosophers, scientists, healers, thinkers, and other great people, and ask them exactly what they thought about about the world that we're living in now, and then also leave a message for people in the future. So this project inevitably led me into this amazing possibility, like new possibility of speculative dreaming that visually I was so bound to because of Africa's history, of Africa's mired, complicated propagandist history, that I could not find myself like wedging away. Every time I would try to, even posting a picture, a picture of an African woman is so loaded with so many different meanings and different agendas, that even when if I even showed you a picture of my auntie, you couldn't even see that it's my auntie unless I said so. You would just think African woman holding a baby, you know. So, and then even when I was making this podcast, Future Lab Africa, I also thought that I wanted this to become something that had nothing to do with the people who are living currently. So a lot of the films, a lot of the technologies of the artwork were all pushed to like have it current and make it now and make it hit for now, or make it, is this acceptable on Instagram? Can you like chop it and move it and dissect it and capture the eyes of people now? And what I wanted to do was to actually create something that had nothing to do with anybody right now, but have a complete conversation to people who are living 100 years from now. So Future Lab Africa is an experiment, actually, in time travel. And it's also an experiment in sci-tech storytelling. It's also an experiment in inviting other people to, through the use of sound and imagination, actually leave this present time and go to this weird other space where you can have a conversation with a generation that doesn't even exist. Does this make sense? Because this is the time to say it doesn't make sense and you should stop. Yes. Okay. So these are my basic objectives, you know, with Future Lab Africa, and actually all of the projects from now on. And this is why I've been going into farming. This is why I built a school. This is why I'm doing this experimentation. Is because I want to be responsible to invite people to like actually enhance and generate their curiosity about like being in this space where they're having a dialogue or conversation with the future. Does that mean it's like a futurist enterprise? Yes. So, if without much further ado, I just wanted to show you a little bit about like some of the episodes that I've done. They're quite strange. Some of them are interviews. Some of them involve music that has been lost. I've also been trying to archive music and put music pieces in there that I know that because this comes from a very random place in Benin, YouTube is probably not going to keep it. It's going to get rid of it. It's going to have 72 views. So I've been trying to collect even little pieces of archival, I guess, pieces of spaces in Africa and put them within the podcast so that future generations can like find the link to that, if that makes sense. Yes. So I guess I want to play you a little bit, an excerpt. Is that okay? Are you curious now? Oh my goodness. And the reason it's on the last slide. I don't know if you press play. Not yet. I just want to explain a little bit about it. This is an episode that I recorded a few months ago, and it features the words of Binyavanga Wainaina, and he was an exceptional writer from Kenya who is extremely brave and also quite not ready for our time. I felt like he was way ahead of us in terms of the conversations that we had, but he had this ability of like not apologizing for it. Of always like bringing us into conversation that we really needed to have now. And I come from a country that is very, we really avoid tough conversations as much as possible. You know, we like to sweep things under the rug. So Binyavanga's experience was actually quite difficult, you know, because he had so many people try to shut him down. So it was quite interesting to me that like when I first heard when I first read Binyavanga's talk, and his talk is called How Not to Write About Africa, I have, for the last 11, 12 years, tried to keep it alive somehow, either by making artwork from it, either by like posting it a million times on the internet, and then finally including it on my podcast. So I just wanted to play this. Can you play this? Yeah? So we can enjoy it. And then we can come back for questions. Yeah, so I think I would rather much have a conversation with questions than speak more, just to see what you guys have to think and what you guys are thinking about this topic, so that I can go back to Kenya with my belly full and know that I came to Sheffield, cold, freezing Sheffield, for a reason. So thank you. Yeah.
We have about 5 minutes for questions left, but otherwise we get a big round of applause for that and the inspiring, touching. Thank you, Jepchumba. So we have about 5 minutes for questions. We have 2 roving mics. If anyone has any questions?
Hi, thank you. It was a great presentation. I love your work, and thank you for everything that you're doing. My question is kind of about, how do you see or define what is African history in relation to like what role does the diaspora play, and how does the diaspora tied to African history, like people in the US or in Europe? Because lately I see like there's a lot of discussion about, I don't know, in particular recently with what happened with British black actors versus US actors and this whole thing that happened on the internet. Or in the US there was often a divide between like black African immigrants and black Americans. And I feel like there's often these rifts within the diaspora, but are we all part, do you see as being part of this history? And when you're creating these stories, what role do you see the diaspora playing? And a kind of a tag-along question to that is, I was having a conversation recently about, and I've had this with multiple people where they say, oh, South Africa is in real Africa, or the North Africa or the Maghreb is in real Africa. And I'm kind of curious to see, like, what do you see as Africa? And I guess the relationship of race within that definition of Africa, right? Because now through history, there's so many different ethnicities that live there, and what role does that play in when you're crafting or curating, I guess, history of Africa?
Okay, what a question. and I'm so glad that you asked it, because I think it speaks to what a headache it is coming from Africa and being an artist. Because even before you hit your paintbrush to the canvas, there's 3,000 questions like that. First of all, like, who am I to say this? Am I African enough? Like, if I say this and this is my experience, what if it's not the experience of another African? Am I in trouble? What about somebody discovers, like, suddenly that, ooh, I'm an African who likes to watch, Seinfeld. Oh, like, am I African enough? Like, would that disqualify me in this conversation? And I think that's the thing that you're bringing up in terms of all these complexities, is because we never allow people from Africa just to be people. We never allow their stories just to be a story about somebody like Jill. And that's the things that she's going. Jill has to be loaded with all of these like identities that she has to answer for and speak to. So like in terms of a response for your question, it's like, first of all, I would say like everybody should read this book called The Invention of Africa, because it's great. In terms of even talking about alternative realities, you just realize how many alternative realities that we're living in. And then also like, my thing is, I guess, I'm trying to provide an alternative. Like, forget all of those questions. Like, what if you don't have to answer to any of that and you just got to make things? Like, couldn't that be the new possibility for people from Africa and from the diaspora, or for Black people to have, where we're not in this constant dialogue? And also, like, we have this feeling of we have to be responsible for so much and so many other things, because it's like a particular place in the world that hasn't had that much voice, you know? So I would just say ignore all those questions and just keep doing what you do. And my rule of thumb is always to never ask for permission first, ask for forgiveness later. In terms of like when you're first making something and you have all these things that you're like, who am I? What place is it? Am I being offensive? Am I doing? It's like put it out there first so that people can have that dialogue, you know, and then give people the space to have those arguments about like where does this fit exactly and who can speak about this. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, but more in the sense like you're curating these stories, right, that are going into this time capsule.
Yes.
And it's Future Lab Africa. So do you have any rules of what goes into it and how do you choose it? Like, and how do you define Africa? Is it just anything from this continent, or is it kind of a place that exists throughout time in the future, or like how do you curate it?
I guess the constraints that I have within those things are people who I interview, the people who are within the podcast have a passion and idea about the notion of Africa. And their work is always tugging about that. Whereas whether they're like a software developer in technology who's working in AI and is wondering like, where is Africa in this conversation, you know, of artificial intelligence or facial recognition, like where's my face? I guess those are the guiding things of people who are questioning, but I don't want it to limit in that scope. And I'm hoping that as more and more people realize, they'll realize that we're much more connected in terms of our experiences than we think about, and that all of us have an incredible technological historical legacy that started from Africa. Yeah. Wow, it's like a really good question.
Hi, I love what you're doing. I think it's really great. I have a sort of similar project that I do over in Manchester, which is future visioning, where I get people to close their eyes and imagine themselves, and I use this sort of sonorous, meditative voice to project them into the future, and by picturing a clock, and then describing, asking them questions which help them imagine what they see when they get there. And I've done this with about 250 people so far. And what I find is that they separate into people who are really utopian in what they're imagining is sort of peace and prosperity, and people who are really dystopian in that they think the world is going to fall apart. But the majority of people actually think that it's going to be more of the same, except with flying cars. And I was wondering, what kinds of things are people talking about that you talk to?
I think first of all, I wanted to bring up the point of that meditative voice of bringing people into the future. And if you guys are interested in creating and making things, one thing I can say is that sound and voice is so powerful. Like a lot of things that I would have had to get away with if I had done this in a visual way, I don't even have to think about when it comes to sound. Like even simple things like using water has a way of, like, I don't know, we really react as human beings to the sound of water. It's like a very transmutive device, like to take people into another mind space. So it's like interesting that you said that. And in terms of like what people are imagining the future to be like, it's quite interesting. There's this thing about like what that somehow one person that I interviewed describes the future as a place where we are not necessarily as connected to our physical bodies, that we really explore these ideas of like teleporting, cross-species, sort of having the ability to like transform yourself into an animal and come back, different ideas. Like, and I like this person's idea of imagining of the future because it's sort of what we're already doing is trying to understand these realities where we're not hardwired so much into our bodies because we have these different technologies that allow us to live in these alternative forms, you know? So a lot of the conversations that I seem to have are not necessarily like doom or gloom or there's not this apocalypse, it's not a apocalypses versus no apocalypse future imagining. It's more like even in science fiction, Africa has never been allowed in science fiction movies, really, generally. Like in terms of like, the world is ending, you never really see somebody in Nairobi going, oh no, a meteorite. Or like, oh, it's aliens. It's always like in Tokyo or Los Angeles or Sydney. Or the San Francisco Bridge, which always gets destroyed. So there's never been like this imagining of Africans being in the future, which is quite interesting, and so the reactions are so varied. Yeah, there's no one particular thing. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jepchumba,
Yeah.
and for your questions. Now we get to enjoy the Sheffield weather, and hopefully at some point today we can all communally jump in the time machine. We now have about an hour for lunch or so, so we can resume back here for 1:55, and if you're okay to take your bags and coats with you, that would be great.
Thank you so
See you
much.
soon.